Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's video, well, I've been on a bit of a Dave Symanski kick over the course of the last year, covering a wide range of his games. And yet, there's one I'd failed to tackle, and today I'm changing that since I dove headlong into his horror-flavored FPS, Dusk. Which means I get to ask the question, did this boomer shooter treat me well long into the night, or did a sense of disappointment dawn on me? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Something terrible has happened within the rural town of Dusk, a festering darkness which feeds on the misery of its men and women. And yet, that eldritch secret holds an allure, a power great enough to warrant the military taking interest, even as it devours those who once called Dusk home. You knew all this and came all the same, and though they captured you, though they left you to hang on a pair of meat hooks within the guts of a gore-soaked cellar, your determination will not be denied. A chainsaw revs in the darkness and you're no longer alone. Welcome to Dusk. Now, as theatrical as this sounds, it will likely take a player a while to piece together the broader strokes of the game, because Dusk isn't actually that concerned with spoon-feeding its story to a player. The protagonist is, by and large, mute, and though some of the enemies may chatter, most of the exposition you'll receive will come from the mysterious voice taunting you along your journey, whose mocking laughter sometimes segues into small details which help to better flesh out the world. Beyond that, however, the bulk of the story comes from navigating the environment itself, with details provided through the level design, some of the set pieces involving enemies, there's a rather neat conflict you walk in on, for instance, as well as smaller details, such as certain objects that you can interact with during the stages. These latter elements are actually among some of the more notable as well, given they provide some rare moments where the players provided any semblance of insight into the Dusk Dude's mindset, with a late-game example of this even providing some context for his journey as a whole. And that's not even the whole of it either. If you were a fan of the end-of-episode text scrolls you'd seen in things like the original Doom episodes, you'll also have that to look forward to here, which helps to provide a small slice of concrete context. Though, I'd say nothing is quite as concrete as the very final stage, and the surprises it has in store for a player, especially with how its ending plays out. All in all, it's definitely an interesting journey, and one which provides a fair bit of variety in how it chooses to embrace its horror, ranging from a pulpy sort of hillbilly horror, morbid occultism, as well as more uncanny elements as you progress deeper into the game's guts. Admittedly, I did find myself having to go out of my way to stop and smell the roses, in large part because Dusk was a lot faster paced than I expected, even as far as other boomer shooters are concerned. You are, in fact, incredibly fast, which helps a great deal given that your tutorial, yes I am air quoting, no you can't see it, anyways, it kicks you off in a room surrounded by chainsaw-wielding maniacs with nothing to defend yourself but a set of short-range sickles. You are very quickly taught to sink or swim, and that enemies can hit you for a fairly significant amount, which really helps to set the tone. And yet, it feels quite fair. Despite having a rather diverse set of enemies to encounter, the likes of which continue to be added onto with each of the game's 3 episodes, not a single one of them is scan hit, putting the responsibility of taking damage firmly on your shoulders, especially once you factor in the fact that you're not just fast, you're also graced with the ability to do a dramatic sliding dash if you crouch while moving. Between that and the lack of reloading, there were definitely moments where I forgot this was supposed to be horror-flavored and thought I'd wandered into a John Woo flick. And this focus on the action is only further complemented by the array of weapons you'll acquire. While some of these are simple enough, such as the pistols and shotguns you'll encounter early on, whose big nuance is the ability to go guns akimbo with them, a fair number of your later weapons have more interesting properties. For instance, your starting sickles can parry incoming projectiles if you can time hitting one. There's also a sniper rifle and crossbow, which can both pierce through enemies, with the latter even going through walls, That said, the weapon I found the most interesting was the sword. While it's front and center in the 3rd episode, there's actually one secreted away in episode 1 as well, albeit without the helpful tutorial that lets you know that it gains a charge attack when you're at 100 health or higher, and also fails to tell you that it has the ability to reflect projectiles when you're over a certain amount of morale, both of which are very powerful tools in its arsenal and helps to provide it a very unique identity within the roster of weapons you get. Still, despite the relatively high-octane pace that the stages can ramp up to, there's plenty of reasons to take things at a slower pace. For instance, you can actually sneak up on enemies, allowing you to stealthily dispatch one with, say, a sword, and whittle down the number of foes you'd normally have to face. Though this isn't quite as effective on the game's higher difficulties. Sure, on paper you'd think being able to mitigate the boosted damage and relentless attacks by sneakily shooting someone would be a viable solution, but the unfortunate fact of the matter is it also increases their awareness range, and even on lower difficulties, if you factor in the enemy's ability to see you from vast distances if they're facing your direction, in tandem with the inability to break aggro when leaving their line of sight, and the stealth element ultimately winds up feeling like more of a novel concept, or that can potentially mitigate some situations if you get extremely clever with some impromptu platforming, but which isn't super likely to play heavily into your long-term survival strategies, which brings me into the actual reason I found myself taking my time, and simply put, it's the stage design. Dusk does an excellent job at providing a diverse set of levels to navigate, each with their own identity insofar as layout, the arrangement of enemies you'll face off against. There's even moments where the game will see you plunging into darkened corridors, deprived of a flashlight, so you'll be forced to creep forward through those dimly lit halls, relying on your ears, just so you can hear the distant wheeze of a creature to know you're not alone. It's absolutely great stuff. Even when it doesn't handicap you with things like a broken light source, it'll still find a way to give you pause. For instance, I found the moment where I meandered into a stage only to be greeted by heaps of dead soldiers in silence to be incredibly memorable. Or when the game sent me into the guts of the Escher Labs, where I found myself unable to trust my own memory of the stage's layout before it outright transitioned into a curious platforming puzzle. That said, even beyond these elements, there is one thing beyond all else that absolutely forced me to take my time. And that was the sheer number of secrets scattered throughout each stage. Provided I did a bit of astute searching, there were discrete breakable vents to discover on floors or walls, cracked surfaces that could be blown apart with explosives, or discrete switches which might pave the way to a hidden trove, or a darkened passage which contained much needed ammo, health, and armor. There's also a few moments where I wound up discovering some small platforming puzzles, which actually felt interesting because they were wholly optional, and mostly boiled down to clever ways to access areas which seemed out of bounds, like just details in the stage, and weren't. And it doesn't even stop there either, since a secret would occasionally chain into another one, and then another, turning it into a rushing nesting doll, secluded nooks. One of the big ones which really sticks in my mind is the moment the game introduced the climbing pick power-up, which allows you to vertically scale walls, which not only changes the way that you can navigate stages and the way you need to look at the level up, it also provided interesting ways to go and revisit areas you'd been in, those secluded nooks, and find brand new things in them. It's just so interesting, and it really cemented it as my favorite power-up of any I'd encounter, even with the offensive applications of the other two, which are admittedly sort of mixed blessings, since one allows you to attack super quickly and burn through your ammo recklessly, and the other slows down enemies to a standstill when you're not moving, but in turn makes combat feel like a bit of a slog. That said, maybe it sticks out because I have so few mechanical gripes about the game. For instance, while the game has no autosaves, it allows you to save freely, and you have a chapter select option, which means even if you somehow save over your own save file, you're not really that hard pressed. In fact, once you've gone through the game, it even gives you the option of starting a stage with a better weapon loadout, in case you wanted an especially brutal victory lap. Or you wanted to try the die-in one-hit Duskmare mode, which, no, just no. Even with the ability to save freely, that sounds painful. Though I'll admit I am tempted to poke back in because there are a set of optional stages to tackle with one hidden in each episode. Of the three, I only managed to find one, the Ratacombs, which was in episode 3, but it was a fun enough experience that I was curious to see what the others brought as far as challenges and level design. Especially now that I'm able to mitigate the whole losing all my items at the beginning of each episode thing, because for some reason, Dusk describes to the Mega Man School of Weapons Storage. Still, despite that hiccup in momentum, I do have to give the game credit for being fairly generous in its death-dealing distribution, as there tends to be a decent amount of weapons to be found in each stage. I'm not talking ammo packs either. You're able to recover a solid arsenal quickly enough, which I feel works rather synergistically with Dusk's Intruder mode, which I haven't talked about, but essentially it's a feature that you can toggle that forces you to start each stage a bit differently, and forces you to comb over them more thoroughly because you lose all of your murderous accessories at the end of each stage. As far as difficulty modifiers go, it's definitely an interesting choice. That's enough about mechanics, even though they are certainly a key part of what held my attention. And I say this because I would be remiss if I didn't mention the effort placed into the game's aesthetics. While the graphics are a lot simpler than what some people might be used to, I still found myself appreciating Dusk's world, as it provides you a range of regions to romp through, from rural cornfields to a rundown gas station, and then far more exotic locales like desolate temples, secret labs, monstrous mechanisms of meat and metal, and more besides. There's a decent amount of variety to be found, which alongside the overall effort put into the level design just helps to keep things fresh. And this extends to the enemies you encounter as well. While the models aren't hyper-realistic, there's still something unsettling about the details at times. What's more, I have to give the game credit for having a number of alternate color schemes, which not only affords some nice little aesthetic options or fun things to play with for people who are feeling nostalgic, they also actually afford some options for colorblind individuals. That said, I think my favorite part of Dusk's presentation wasn't what I was seeing, but rather what I was hearing. While to some degree I'm referring to the game's OST, since there's an excellent arrangement of tunes to reap what the cultists have sown and just kick ass to, and I mean a rather broad OST, the part that really got me was the sound effects themselves, specifically the sound of your enemies. There is something absolutely foreboding about creeping through a darkened hallway only to hear the gasping wheeze of a nearby enemy, or to be alerted to the fact that there is something you cannot see, but you can hear its rasping snort as it draws too close for comfort in an otherwise empty room. It's just really interesting, solid horror sound design, and it's mechanically helpful in a gameplay sense. Plus, there's things like being tipped off to a secret passage because of the audio cue for a nearby power-up in an area that you might otherwise look, averting the trope of having to just pointlessly click on walls like you would in other boomer shooters like the traditional Doom games. In any case, that brings me to the conclusion of this little review, and what I ultimately have to say about Dusk is, well, the game is a well-designed love letter to boomer shooters. Narratively speaking, it does take the game a bit to really warm up and ease into the meat of the story, but mechanically, you're in for a treat from the word go. The first episode, for instance, is a mostly grounded feeling experience with an overall fun but fair level of challenge. There were some memorable moments throughout the journey, solid enemies to fight, and even a few good boss encounters, including the one at the end of the episode. That said, it suckered me in because I was not expecting the second episode to ramp up in difficulty as much as it does, nor for the shift in genre as things gradually began to veer harder and harder into the occult elements and the stage design became a lot more creative. The Escher Labs, like I mentioned earlier, is just such a neat and memorable level, and it doesn't even stop there either. It continues to provide more and more interesting and difficult scenarios the whole time. And then I reached the third episode, and it was at this point that the game really started to feel like a horror game, because it very deliberately dials back the pace while you have to navigate cavernous ruins and caliginous corridors. Overall, I felt this segment was generally easier than the second episode, but there's definitely some nasty segments to encounter, including a pair of back-to-back boss fights which feel very distinct from any of the other fights in the game. Also, as much as I say that this one feels generally easier, it actually does contain the most difficult stage that I struggled with out of any of the episodes. Overall, it's just delightful, which is ultimately why I can safely call Dusk a solid hit. It's a legitimately good boomer shooter. It provides some great horror moments without relying on scripted jump scares, and it just feels so well balanced and fun and funny. God help me when I learned the whole spinning your gun when you reload things actually did damage. This game happily has a laugh at its own expense occasionally, which just helps to provide some breathing room where it just embraces its hammy roots, and I love it to pieces because it helps to break things up. Oh, and before I get called out for being remiss, the multiplayer's alright. If you miss the ludicrously fast-paced Quake multiplayer, there's Dusk Worlds, which is essentially a deathmatch mode where you can try your hand against other super fast contenders. While it wasn't heavily populated, those who were there kicked my fucking teeth in, so if you really want the opportunity to go and be a tryhard, just go to it. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video descriptions to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.